Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Before we begin, can I just ask, can you hear and see me? Could you just nod your head if you can, please? Thank you. Well, it's now 9:30 and it's time for me to open this hearing session on Matter 3, housing provision, with particular reference to the 5-year housing land supply. My name is Karen Baker and I'm a Chartered Town Planner. I've been jointly appointed with Mike Hayden, who is also a Chartered Town Planner, by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 as amended, to hold this examination into the soundness of the Ipswich Borough Council Local Plan Review, which I shall refer to from now on as the plan, and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regards to soundness. Could I just remind everyone, please, to ensure that your mobile phones are switched off or that they're on silent while the hearing is in session? And could you also please ensure that your microphone is muted until you are invited to speak, so that we can avoid any disturbance from background noise or feedback from microphones on computers? The hearing session is being live streamed as well as being recorded by the Council, and it will be published shortly after on the Council's YouTube channel with a link from the examination website so that interested parties can view. Our role as inspectors is to assess whether the plan satisfies the requirements of the 2004 Act, the relevant regulations, and whether or not it is sound. In order to be sound, the National Planning Policy Framework states that plans should be positively prepared, justified, effective and consistent with national policy. Annette Feeney is the Programme Officer for the examination. Good morning, Annette. And Annette works for us and independently from the Council. She is responsible for all administrative arrangements, and outside the hearing sessions, any contact you make with us should be through Annette. Our guidance note, which can be found on the examination website at J6, outlines the procedures to be followed at the hearing sessions, the way in which written representations will be dealt with, and the availability of information. The way that we expect participants to behave during the hearing sessions is also set out for ease of reference in our virtual hearing etiquette guidance, which has been sent out to all participants along with their invitations. The hearing session this morning is programmed to finish no later than 1 o'clock. However, there may need to be some flexibility on that, and we will break for a comfort break between 11 and 11:30. The hearing session will be in the form of a structured discussion, which I shall lead, following the previously circulated agenda, and it's based on the matters, issues and questions paper already circulated. I shall invite people to speak at particular times, but if you have something to contribute at the appropriate part of the discussion, please indicate your wish to speak by using the raise hand function on Zoom. We ask that you keep your cameras switched on for the entire session if possible, but with your microphones muted until you are invited to speak. The only exception to this is where there is more than one participant per representor, and in these cases we would ask that only one participant has their camera on at any one time. And my colleague, Mr. Hayden, as you can see, is also in attendance and may have some questions too. There may be some questions on which we now have enough information, and so there may be little or no discussion on these. And we would also like to remind participants that you should have provided all of your evidence in your original representation, and the hearing sessions are not an opportunity to submit anything further. Any comments you make during the hearing session should therefore relate to points made in your original representation. We have, of course, read your original representations and your hearing position statements, so there will be no need to repeat what you've said already. The purpose of this session is for us to seek clarification or further information on any outstanding questions that we may have. Does anyone have any questions so far? No? Okay. I think we've all attended previous hearing sessions, but could I just ask the participants for this morning's sessions to just introduce themselves, please? Mr. Ford, could I ask you to start on behalf of the Council, please?
Thank you. Yes, good morning, Madam. My name's Tafour and I'm a barrister providing legal advice to the Borough Council. And we have Sarah Barker and Carlos Hone from the Council to speak on the matters arising this morning.
Thank you. And Mr. Crossthwaite, would you like to just say good morning this morning, please?
Thank you. Good morning, inspectors.
Morning.
I'm Richard Costwaite from Gladman Developments.
Thank you. And Mr. Brown?
Thank you. I'm Henry Brown, representing Townbury Planning.
Thank you. And Mr. Berent?
Good morning, Ma'am. Mark Barron from the Home Builders Federation.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Edgley?
Good morning, all. I'm Mark Edgley. I work at Boyer Planning and we're participating in these sessions on behalf of Ipswich School.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. So if we can turn to the agenda then and move on to item 2, which is matter 3, housing provision. And the issue is, has the plan been positively prepared and is it justified, effective and consistent with national policy in relation to its provision for housing? And as I said in my introduction, we will be concentrating on the 5-year housing land supply at this morning's session. And questions 45 to 48 in the MIQs are the ones that are particularly relevant to this session. So I'd like to start, if I may, with just a point of clarification in terms of the 5-year deliverable housing land supply. Mrs. Barker, if I could come to you first from the council's perspective, and it's just really in terms of an update, I think, because if I could ask you to turn to your topic paper, which is D52, and it's reviewing the Ipswich housing figure, including the addendum in June 2020. And then if we can turn to page 16 and to table 5. Do you have that up in front of you?
I'm just, excuse me, I'm just getting there.
That's okay, don't worry.
What, would you mind giving me the table reference again, please?
Yes, sorry, it's table 5. It's the 5-year housing land supply position at the 1st of April 2021.
I've got it, thank you.
Lovely, thank you. It's just really to make reference to potentially updating this table. In terms of the figures used to calculate the 5-year deliverable housing land supply in this topic paper, I think they require updating to reflect the updated figures for net additional dwellings delivered between the 1st of April 2018 and the 31st of March 2021. And Table 3.2 in your hearing position statement for matter 3 confirms that this figure is now 892 completions rather than 863. That's my understanding. Is that right?
That's correct. Excuse me. And in fact, as a result of the more recent document submitted last Friday, case 6, there might be further very small changes to make to the figures.
That's fine. Yes,
these will be minor amendments.
They are. I just wanted to go through them really now so everybody was aware.
Okay.
It doesn't actually make any difference to the 5-year housing land supply, but it was just for clarification really, so everybody was aware of the changes that have been made. So in terms of the completions, that would be amended from 892 rather than the 863 in that table.
It might even be 899, as I understand it, on the basis of the more recent information.
Oh, is it? Okay.
that was submitted on Friday. But it may be easier to work off the figures that you have from the hearing statement.
Thank you. Yes.
We can provide a further update.
I think that would be useful, and we will come on to this later because there may well be some further updates that we require. So. So that would, with my maths, that gives a shortfall of 8 rather than 37, and that would then equate to a 5-year requirement of 1,988 rather than 2,017, and with a 20% buffer, it would be 2,386 rather than 2,420. And that would then equate to an annual requirement of 477 for 5 years rather than 484. Sorry, you're following so far. And then furthermore, the updated housing delivery note updates the supply for the period 2021 to 2026 to 2,428. From my edition, and that's a change from 2,465. However, as I said, these changes still result in a 5.09, which equates to a surplus of around 43 dwellings. So do you agree, for the basis of this morning, that's the appropriate figure that we should be looking at based on the information? I appreciate there may be some slight variations. Mr. Ford, did you want to say something about that?
No, just with your variations and with the updated variations that we're going to provide you, it's still 5.09.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that's fine. That was the point I was trying to get to, but yes, that's where we are. Lovely. Did anybody else have any comments to make on those figures? No? Okay, super. Just really by way of an update for everybody that's in this session this morning, I'm not sure how much of the previous few days sessions you've been watching online, but over the course of the hearing sessions we have had discussions about some of the housing allocations in the plan, and the council has prepared some supplementary evidence in respect of matter 3, and this is the document that Mrs. Barker referred to. Is it K6 or K7 in the examination library?
It's K6.
K6, thank you. I thought it was. So that has been published in the examination library, and I believe it was published on Monday. Certainly as inspectors we received it on Monday. And the council agreed also at the hearing session yesterday to complete a table setting out the evidence that they rely on to support the deliverability assumptions in respect of each site in the 5-year housing land supply. Now, myself and Mr. Hayden will be putting together that table in terms of the headings and the information that is required from the council, and the council have agreed to submit that to us. So in terms of everybody else around this virtual table this morning, does anyone have any comments to make on the council's supplementary evidence that has been submitted at this stage? No? Have you all had the opportunity to see that? Yeah, okay, that's lovely. Thank you. Could I turn then to Mr. Crossthwaite? And the council's trajectory indicates that 679 dwellings will be completed at Ipswich Garden Suburb for the period 2021 to 2026. Having read your hearing position statement, on what basis do you consider that this site would deliver 203 dwellings less in the 5-year housing land supply?
Thank you. It was really the need, and it's something that's discussed in local plan examinations across the country, to sense check some of that information that's provided by site promoters and developers against what can be achieved nationally now. I note, and I haven't had too much time to review the evidence. I was only made aware of it yesterday evening. In K6 that there's been some updates and refreshing in how the council have explained how they come to those figures. But what we've attempted to do in our hearing statement is to sense check it against some of that national data that's provided, for example, through Lichfield's start to finish report, which looks at the sorts of delivery rates that you can expect from sites of this nature. I note that there have been individual years in the past where the sorts of annual average delivery rates have been achieved, but that's very difficult and not really evidenced in terms of the more national average based on an annualized basis. So it's about that sustained delivery at those peak rates, which can be problematic, and I'm not entirely sure that the local evidence justifies that.
Thank you. Mrs. Barker, would you like to come back on that point on behalf of the council?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes. We have touched on this in the K6 evidence document, and also there was some discussion of this under matter 6 on day 3. But the council is confident about these delivery rates at the Ipswich Garden Suburb and points to local evidence that these levels of delivery can be achieved. And the example that has been mentioned previously is at North Colchester, where Mersey Homes, who are one of the significant landholders at Ipswich Garden Suburb, are delivering Chesterwell, adjacent to the Kingswood Heath scheme. That's a total of something that the combined sites are something around 3,000 dwellings. So that is an equivalent scale. And King's Heath has delivered 292 homes in 2018-19, for example. So we do consider that there are examples within Ipswich, but longer ago, but also locally to Ipswich that support the assumptions that we've made for Ipswich Garden Suburb. And the other key point to make, again, that we have touched on in previous discussion is Ipswich Garden Suburb consists of 3 neighbourhoods. Within those neighbourhoods, there in at least 2 cases, there are more than 1 ownership. So we do expect there to be multiple outlets delivering simultaneously at that site.
Thank you. Mr. Crosswaite, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, what I haven't really seen is the evidence of local sites that have delivered those sorts of numbers on a sustained basis. So there may be individual years where you do reach a particular peak, but it's about those peaks and troughs, and can it average out at that high rate? And I think that's the concern that we really wanted to flag up through our statement.
Thank you. Mrs. Barker, has there been a sustained delivery at that rate in terms of the evidence that you provided?
I can certainly say for our own development site at Ravenswood, which was 2000 onwards, we had, for example, 2000, 2001, 200 dwellings, 2002, 2003, 226 dwellings.
Thank you.
So I mean, sorry, so I was just going to say it's not, I mean, it's not even every year, but that, you know, that there is sustained good delivery there.
Thank you. And perhaps in terms of the table that I've spoken of already, perhaps the council can set out the evidence in relation to this site that it relies upon to support the delivery assumptions that have been made in the plan and in the 5-year supply. That would be really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Crosswaite, did you want to say anything finally on this?
No, nothing further beyond what we've said in our statements. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask the question then. Clearly, we've been through a number of sites within the 5-year supply yesterday, and also a number of other sites allocated within the plan in terms of their developability beyond the 5-year supply. Are there any concerns that anyone here has about the deliverability of other sites within the 5-year supply, other than those obviously that we've dealt with at other hearing sessions? No? Okay, that's fine. Mr. Brown, if I could turn to you then, if I may. On what basis do you consider that the council should trigger the review clause within the East Suffolk local plan and identify sites in that borough and others to provide a sufficient buffer of available housing sites should any of the existing allocations fail to deliver in line with the housing trajectory? And just for my purposes, is it policy SCLP 2.1, which you're referring to in the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan, which was adopted in September this year?
That is the policy, yes.
Thank you.
So I think we've touched on it in a previous session, just the level of allocations around Ipswich, because obviously its boundaries are quite constrained. The east of Ipswich area, the number is escaping me now, but there's a very high level of travel into Ipswich from the east of Ipswich economic area. And as the council have noted, there are significant allocations there. So Brightwell Lakes is 2,000 homes, and then there are 300 at is it the former police station, and they're the key allocations for the east of Ipswich. But the problem with both of those is that they have slipped. I think Brightwell Lakes has slipped now by about 4 years, and the other site is, from what I remember, not scheduled to come forward until towards the end of the plan period. Or later, certainly outside 5 years. So I think it's our view is that the most sensible thing to do, given the just marginal housing land supply, is to adopt the plan. We're not saying that this plan should not be adopted, but to then commit to a review with neighbours and look at sites, particularly to the east of Ipswich, which is acknowledged in the Council's evidence base as the source of the highest level of travel in for work. I think it touched on the other point about the lack of family housing in the first few years of the plan. And obviously that's very difficult to provide on the town centre sites. So again, providing homes to the east of Ipswich, where that family housing is needed, in line with paragraph 103 of the NPPF, and just sort of balance out the housing needed.
Thank you. Mrs. Barker, what's the Council's view on an immediate review so that a discussion can be undertaken with neighbours relating to further development to the east of Ipswich?
We do not agree that that would be an appropriate course of action. We've identified a 5-year housing land supply. We have worked across boundary on that, as we've discussed previously. And for example, at Humberducy Lane, there are 150 dwellings allocated on the Suffolk coastal side of the boundary there. So this is a separate allocation, obviously, from the Brightwell one that Mr. Brown refers to.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brown, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think it's just to mention again that I think that I can't remember the exact date now, but I think the Humberducy Lane development, it's not planned to come forward for quite some time.
Mrs. Barker?
This is the cross-boundary allocation that we've discussed under matter 6 on day 3, and there are infrastructure requirements at this site which will need to be met, but there is nothing holding it back as such, provided that the infrastructure needs are met.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we're sort of moving a little bit away from the topic that I wanted to discuss, but if we could move on now to my final question in this on this issue, and in terms of the council's policy, policy ISPA 1 in Ipswich's plan is very similar to SCLP 2.1 of the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan. However, it doesn't include a similar trigger mechanism to that included within the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan. And my question to you, Mrs. Barker, is should it include a similar trigger in your view? And should that be added as a main modification to the plan?
Okay, thank you, Inspector. So sorry, can I just clarify that I understand you? So this is the trigger in the Suffolk Coastal Plan, yes, relating to plan review.
Yes.
Should neighbours
the
short?
Yeah, the policy SCLP 2.1, I think it was changed, wasn't it, through main modification to include the I mean, it's pretty similar to ISPA 1 in Ipswich's plan, but then it goes on to talk about should it be determined through the plan making process that another authority within the ISPA, etc. I don't know if you've got it in front of you, but
yes, I have. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it was if it would be appropriate, given that Ipswich is obviously an authority within the ISPA area, to have a similar trigger within your policy, ISPA 1.
Okay, thank you. I can see that from a consistency point of view, it may be something you would consider. But I think because of the housing land supply situation in Ipswich, and as we've discussed before, the very tightly drawn boundary, the likelihood of the borough being able to take unmet need from another area is small. And so therefore, I mean, that's why it has not been included to date. And that's the position we've taken.
We suspected that was probably the case. I just wanted to ask the question.
Okay.
Thank you. In terms of, just sort of moving on from that, playing devil's advocate really, in terms of an additional statement within that policy, and within policies for one, would it be appropriate, do you feel, to have a trigger in there if the council was unable to meet its 5-year housing land supply, for instance, that's then sought, then the council would seek help from its neighbours if that was the position? Sorry, sort of turning it on its head, if you like. Would that be an appropriate clause to include, given Ipswich's position?
It would be significantly different from the trigger in the Suffolk Coastal Plan, which is specific in its reference to a plan preparation process. I think we would rely on the normal annual monitoring processes in relation to 5-year supply going forward.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Were there any other questions or points that anybody wanted to make in respect of the demonstration of a 5-year deliverable housing land supply in relation to question 45? No. Okay, can we move on then to question 46 and any need for additional deliverable sites? My first question to you, Mrs. Barker, if I may, you refer in your hearing position statement to paragraph 17 of the housing delivery note I-24. Obviously that's now been updated, but that paragraph doesn't differ greatly from what was in the original housing delivery note, and that sets out 3 ways forward should there be a shortfall in the 5-year housing land supply. I just wondered if you could let me know how effective, in your opinion, each of these options would be for delivering more dwellings in the 5-year housing land supply. And just as a reminder, paragraph 17 refers to those options as being, firstly, to review sites in years 6 to 10, secondly, reviewing the SHELAR, and thirdly, reviewing the site building programme for Handford Homes, Ipswich Borough Assets and the council's land as landowner. So would you mind just explaining to me how effective each of those options would be in your view, please?
Okay, yes, thank you, Inspector. In terms of reviewing the SHELAR, we have undertaken an extremely thorough SHELAR process that's included at least 2 rounds of updating, which has also included reviewing site densities. Excuse me, we've identified everything through the SHELAR that we think is suitable and available and achievable. In relation to reviewing sites in years 6 to 10, there is one possible site that may be able to come forward sooner, which we could explore if you consider that that was necessary and appropriate. This is the 3rd site at Ravenswood that we actually discussed yesterday, IP 150D, which was identified in the Statement of Common Ground with Ipswich Borough Council for delivery within 5 years. We decided to take a slightly more cautious approach to that in terms of our 5-year supply. But for example, that is one that we could revisit. That kind of overlaps with the 3rd point as well about reviewing council-owned sites. So I think in terms of the SHELAR, we do feel that we've been as thorough as we can. We've reviewed, as I say, at least 2 times. And at the moment, we consider that what is identified in the 5-year supply is, everything that's realistic and appropriate.
But in terms of if we were to find that there was a shortfall in the 5-year supply, for instance, and then you're suggesting to us that one of the options would be to review the SHELAR. from what you're saying, it sounds like there wouldn't be much scope for further sites to come forward from that. Is that a reasonable assumption from what you've just said? Because you've already reviewed that twice.
We do feel that's a reasonable assumption, and you know, as I say, the sites that we have not identified as allocations or within the 5-year supply are not suitable, not available, or not achievable in our view. And you know, the reasons for those decisions may be issues such as flood risk, which may become resolvable in the future, but at the moment, our position is that we don't feel there's a great deal of scope from further review of the Sheila at this stage.
Okay, so in other words, it's not really an option then, is it? In terms of the options that have been put forward.
Well, as I've mentioned, the one site where it may be a possibility, but I think yeah, there's limited scope with that option.
Okay, Ms. Tafur, did you want to say something?
Thank you, Madam. I was just going to add that Mrs. Barker just touched upon it about the potential issues with flood risk, and I understand that the SPD is being reviewed. And it, you know, at the moment, the Sheila has identified certain sites as unsuitable because of flood risk, and it may be that once the SPD is updated, that there is a change in the council's position, but that process hasn't been undertaken yet.
Okay, so you're sort of suggesting that there may be a possibility in terms of the reviewing the Sheila going forward once the SPD has been updated.
Exactly, there isn't currently, but there may be potential for that in the future.
But how would that, sorry, Mr. Hayden, I'll just follow up on that. I'll come to you in a second. But how would that help us as inspectors if we were to find that there was a shortfall in this 5-year supply? Timescale for that SPD being updated.
I'll have to defer to Mrs. Barker for the timescale for that being updated.
The aim is to have a draft by March 2021.
Okay. Mr. Hayden, did you want to say anything further about that?
Well, thank you, Ms. Baker. I was just seeking some clarification as to how that update will make any difference.
Well, obviously it's difficult to prejudge what will be determined, but at the moment the council has a particular position on whether safe escape can be achieved on sites, and it may be that the potential for refuge rather than escape is explored as part of the SPD process, for example.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. But in terms of the timescales, Mrs. Barker just said that the aim is to have a draft by March 2021. Well, clearly we're in a position now where we're almost towards the end of the hearing sessions, and we would hope to be looking towards main modifications in the new year. Would that SPD draft come along a little bit too late, Mr. Thor, in your view?
It may be. My I suppose understanding of the question was what would the position be if the council fell short of the 5-year supply? It seems to me that you're saying on adoption, what
yes,
can be done before that? Yes. So if there is a shortfall at some stage, then there are options open to the council. But I can see that with the timescales that you're discussing, that might be too late for this process.
Okay, thank you. In terms of, if I could move on then slightly from there, did you want to say anything further, Mrs. Barker, about the Ipswich Borough Council, Ipswich Borough assets and Hanford Homes and the council's land as landowner, or do you feel you've said enough? Obviously, we talked about 150D at Ravenswood, which is currently in years 6 to 10, potentially coming forward into the 5-year supply. But is there anything else you wanted to say in terms of reviewing the site building programme that the council has in hand?
I don't think I need to add anything other than to reiterate the point that's been made on previous days that, you know, the council is actively delivering, and we've seen that with the current site at Tooks, which is nearing completion, 60 dwellings.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the Tooks site was mentioned a few times yesterday, wasn't it? So thank you for that. Moving on then, if I may. Oh, Mr. Hone, did you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, just thank you, Madam. Further to yesterday's discussions, I think we were going to provide you a clarification note to give you a bit more information about the companies and their arrangements for bringing sites forward. So we are starting to prepare that, and we will provide it to you in due course. Certainly with the years 1 to 5 housing supply, it's not obviously just the Borough Council that is delivering houses within those sites, and we discussed a number of sites yesterday. However, through the most recent discussions that we've been having with some landowners, it may well be that sites which are later on in the plan period do come forward in the years 1 to 5. I did mention a site the other day, the Island site, which is in the centre of the town within the waterfront, and a memorandum of understanding that is in place between the Borough Council, the landowner, Associated British Ports, Suffolk County Council, and the New Anglian LEP, to try and bring that forward. And we have had open discussions pre-app. There's a number of documents that have been produced by the landowner with regards to bringing that site forward. So it is anticipated, although clearly we don't have in the first 5 years, that site, and there is another one as well that might come forward in 5 years. So we will look to review those and try and provide maybe a bit more certainty on them to include them in the first 5 years.
Thank you, that's helpful. Apologies if I disappeared from your screen. My camera suddenly stopped working for some reason. I did hear everything you said, Mr. Hone, and I hope you can still hear me. But I had a slight moment of panic when my screen went blank, so apologies for that. Hopefully any technical difficulties will be ironed out. If I could move on then to my next question, and that is, would the council consider the need for the allocation of additional sites should we find any shortfall in the 5-year housing land supply on adoption? Mrs. Barker, would you consider that as a council?
I mean, in principle, I don't see why not. Obviously, we would need to be satisfied that they've been through the proper consideration in the same way that the sites that we've allocated have. And we've spoken before about the very detailed assessments they've had through the SHELAR process, through the sustainability appraisal process, etc. I mean, I think the other point I would make in relation to flexibility is that at present we do not count care home places within our supply or completions. We do monitor them, but we've kept them separate. So there is some level of additional flexibility that may be available through that route as well.
Okay, is there any reason why the council doesn't count them, or a percentage of them? I know that there are various calculations that can be made, aren't there, in terms of the numbers, but is there any reason why the council doesn't include those in its figures?
Only that it's been quite a recent change through the PPG, and that over the years, you know, they've been in and out a few times. So, you know, we just feel it's a more cautious approach to monitor them separately.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of numbers, in terms of care home places, do you have any idea of the difference that would make to the 5-year supply, for instance?
At the moment, the one development I'm aware of is again at Westerfield House, IP 280, which we discussed yesterday. That has a permission in place and actually implemented, I think, or started for 38 additional care bed places.
Okay.
Now, I completely acknowledge that would not translate to 38 dwellings, but we believe our rate of adults, you know, as per the census, would be about 1.8.
Okay. Thank you. And finally, on this point, I'd like to come to Mr. Berend, if I may. Why do you consider that the identification of additional sites to bolster supply would be preferable to any changes to the step trajectory?
Thank you, Anne. I think it's effectively coming back to PPG and what PPG requires in terms of the step trajectory, and it's in terms of to ensure that planned requirements are fully met, but also that there isn't continued to delay in meeting identified needs. So it's really a case of ensuring that if there is a need for additional supply in order to achieve a 5-year land supply, it should be done in terms of identifying sites. So it doesn't actually then push back further the delivery of homes through a more generous step, as it were, in terms of the council's position. So it's really about coming back to PPG and ensuring that there isn't that further delay in terms of homes that are needed now are provided later on in the plan period.
Thank you. I seem to be doing a disappearing act this morning, so apologies. I may have a loose connection somewhere, so I will have a look shortly. Mrs. Barker, did you want to come back on that point?
No, I don't think so, thanks.
Okay, well, perhaps that takes me on to the next. Oh, Mr. Edgley, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to say something about this?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. I don't know whether I should have jumped in a little bit earlier when we were talking about the Sheila. So apologies if I sort of messed up the notes a little bit on that. But I think kind of taking along the lines of the need for additional sites, as I think we've outlined in our hearing statements, we do think there is that need. Obviously, as the council have outlined, they could bring forward sites from years 6 to 10, but I think, as we've discussed in previous sessions, there's quite there's areas of concern about some of them, as we've discussed. And the reviewing the Sheila, the council just spoke about things like changes due to flood risk. I just wonder whether there'd be sort of opportunities for a bit more of a comprehensive review of the Sheila. We obviously heard yesterday about Ravenswood and the land that's used for sport facilities, and there've been no sort of identified plan or proposal firmed up at the moment. And I think that's there's similarities there with the land at Tuddenham Road, which is also identified for sport facilities. I think there is opportunities elsewhere within the district, within the borough, if the council was to look a bit more of a fundamental review of the Sheila. And I think ultimately, looking to do them things, would identify, or potentially could identify, additional sites which over the plan period could be deliverable. I completely agree with what the council have said around them needing to be subject to sustainability appraisal and all the proper tests, but obviously that would include and integrate additional sites, which I think would be helpful over the plan period.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Barker, did you want to come back on that point?
Yeah, thank you. I think the key point is that we've been through our Sheila process, and we believe we've identified all the sites that are suitable, available and achievable. It's just that key point again. Obviously, as Boyer Planning acknowledged in their position statement, that the land at Tuddenham Road would not be able to help us with 5 years at any rate. It would be later in the plan process.
Okay, well, I don't really want to get into specific sites at this point. And as I think we've said earlier on in the hearing sessions, if we were to come to the conclusion that additional sites should be allocated, we would come to the council and ask the council to look at that. It wouldn't be for us to identify sites. It would be for the council to take that away and consider which sites would be appropriate to be allocated. Mr. Edgley, did you want to say anything finally on that before we move on? No, okay, thank you. Mr. Berent just touched on the step trajectory, so perhaps that's a good point at which to move on to question 47 and the approach to the step trajectory. And Mrs. Barker, would an alternative approach to the stepping of the housing trajectory be justified given the government's objective of significantly boosting the supply of homes?
Thank you, Inspector. We believe that the approach we've taken to the stepping is realistic and justified in relation to the government guidance. It reflects our key strategic site, which we've already discussed at length in previous sessions, which will really...
Sorry, I should have probably clarified it a little bit. I meant in terms of if we were to find that there was a shortfall in the 5-year supply, and you say, I think in your hearing position statement, that you would prefer to amend the step trajectory rather than finding additional sites. So that was the basis of the question. No, it's fine. I realised you'd misunderstood my question, and that's my fault for putting the question in the wrong terms. But in terms of any alternative approach to the stepping of the housing trajectory, how would that sort of sit with the government's objective of significantly boosting the supply of homes?
Because it's still basically linked to the delivery of our strategic site at Ipswich Garden Suburb, and the difference that makes to our delivery rates, as shown through the trajectory and the 5-year supply. We did, in the position statement, provide an illustration showing 250 and 565 as the stepped rates, really following the line of questioning that perhaps something that more closely aligns to our trajectory figures would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you. So are you suggesting a proposed change in that regard?
I think certainly looking at the question of flexibility, it does provide a little more flexibility. Looking at the question which objectors have raised, is it holding anything back? No, it's not holding anything back. We're absolutely delivering everything that we can, including through the council's own delivery. So I think it would be a pragmatic way forward.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brent, if I could come back to you in terms of this point. Did you want to say anything in response to Mrs. Barker's points there?
Again, I think it's coming back to my original point of what the PPG says in terms of ensuring there isn't a continued delay. And whilst I appreciate that the council's delivery won't be affected by that, because that's what it's setting out, it's whether if they don't meet that need, what then happens as a result. So it's really about how that mechanism of the 5-year land supply and how that then feeds into ensuring that there is sufficient homes coming forward to meet the overall need, and that need within the 5 years is affected. And I think by stepping it too significantly away, then you potentially reduce the impact of those mechanisms that the government have put in place to try and ensure that housing comes forward as quickly as possible and in the right way. So I think that'd be my concern in terms of study. I think that was with our original concern back in Reg 19, before obviously all the supply has changed, that was there too much being given in terms of too much headroom, and in order minimising the effectiveness of the 5-year land supply as set out in the MPPF. So that's our main concern. So it's actually setting it at the right level to ensure to drive delivery within the plan, but obviously not wanting to see a plan being found sound on adoption. But I think it just needs to ensure that there is. It's holding the council's feet to the fire, as it were, in terms of the 5-year land supply. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Barker, did you want to come back on that?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, obviously our position is that we've identified a 5-year supply with the stepping of 300 and 540, but we would not be averse to revisiting that if you considered that appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Crosthwaite, did you want to make a point about the step trajectory?
Yes, please. I agree with much of what Mr. Burrent said in relation to the step trajectory. I think it would be a retrograde step if we did look to amend that at this stage. Really, points that I've made through representations point towards the limited sources of supply, particularly as you move through the planned period. And that means that if there's any slippage off any of those larger sites, there's a risk. I don't think delaying further in terms of the step trajectory would improve flexibility in the plan. It just adds to that risk of relying on the limited sources of supply that are there, particularly as you move on through the plan period. So it's going to be really important through monitoring to ensure that when there is a need for a review to take place of this plan and introduce new sites, that it can take place. And that might be in line with what the PPG says in relation to a review and update within 5 years, for example. But I think if you are minded to agree with some of the delivery rates that have been agreed that the council is relying on within its 5-year supply, and that marginal supply is agreed, I think that's an acceptable approach. We think that there's a risk related to that. I think there's further risk to housing delivery in line with the government's ambitions to significantly boost if you start to push that step trajectory even further back.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Barker, do you want to say anything finally on this before we move on?
I don't think I have anything further to add, thank you.
It looks like Mr. Hone does though. So Mr. Hone, can I come to you?
Thank you. It's more of a wider point and bringing us back to where we started with the sessions about our cooperation with our neighbours across the Ipswich board area, where which is identified across the wider housing need area, the wider housing market area. And obviously we're working with our colleagues in those authorities, and there is oversupply in those areas consistently in the as identified in their AMR processes. So the immediate housing need for the housing market area is being captured through Baber Mid Suffolk delivery and East Suffolk delivery as well. So I would say that whilst the step trajectory, and there are obviously points which have been raised regarding that, the actual housing need and delivery on housing need is being captured across a broader housing market area.
Thank you, that's very useful. Does anybody else have any comments on that before we move on? No? Okay. Can we move on then to the way forward for the plan in question 48? And I just have a few supplementary questions in relation to that. Mrs. Barker, if I could start with you, if we were to conclude that a 5-year supply of specific deliverable housing sites would not exist on adoption, on what basis do you consider that the most appropriate way forward would be to reduce the stepped housing requirement for the first 6 years of the plan period, and increase the requirement for the latter 12 years to provide greater flexibility in the 5-year supply? Clearly, we've probably already dealt with that, but is there anything else that you would like to add in terms of that point?
Thank you, Inspector.
Apologies for asking it twice. This is the
That's
trouble.
okay, that's okay. I don't think I do have a great deal more to add. I'm just, sorry, probably backtracking slightly to the issue of flexibility. The one thing I haven't mentioned this morning is the windfall assumption. And I know we've discussed that before and not wanting to reopen that, but I would just reiterate that we've been very, very cautious with our windfall assumption at 50 dwellings per annum. So again, another point of flexibility. But no, in relation to possibly reducing the stepped housing requirement for the first 6 years, as set out in our position statement, we consider that that would be one way to provide greater flexibility if needed.
Thank you. And really touching on a point that we've already probably discussed it as well. Again, if we were to conclude that there wasn't a 5-year supply on adoption, and if we were to conclude that altering the step trajectory was not an appropriate approach, in order to significantly boost the supply of homes within the borough. Is there capacity within the borough boundary to allocate additional deliverable housing sites to meet any shortfall in the first 5 years, in your view?
We don't consider there is. We consider that we've identified everything that we can.
Okay. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to say? Sorry, Ms. Tafur.
Thank you, Madam. Just a brief point. I understand, obviously, and Mrs. Barker accepted the point made about holding the council's feet to the fire, as it were, with the stepping of the trajectory. But this is a council that isn't reluctant to allocate sites or to see housing delivered. It's identified and allocated every site that the Sheila said was suitable to be allocated. It grants planning permission for sites which come forward. It's got 3 of its own house building companies. So I totally understand the point about not allowing councils undue flexibility in the stepping of the requirement, but in this case, it's not for want of trying. The council simply thinks that it may be more realistic if you have concerns about the delivery, given that there aren't other sites in their view that can be delivered and that could assist with the 5-year supply, to step the trajectory.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That's very helpful. Really, what other options would exist? Are there any other options that would exist, and how effective would these be? In addition, obviously, to the options that we've already talked about in terms of paragraph 17 of the updated housing delivery note. Are there any other options that the council could consider if we were to find that there was a shortfall in terms of the 5-year housing land supply on adoption? Mrs. Barker, could I ask you that question? Sorry, that's putting you on the spot a little bit, isn't it?
Thank you, Inspector. It's I think it's the areas of flexibility that I have referred to already, which would be, for example, including care home permissions and completions within the supply, and I'm looking at the likelihood of windfall delivery through the plan period, which you know is extremely likely to exceed 50 dwellings per annum.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Hayden, sorry.
Could I just ask Ms. Barker a question on the windfall figures, actually, in your
of course.
In your matter 3 supplementary housing delivery statement. So I don't know whether you would mind just opening that up. So it's K6, I think, isn't it? And it's section 2 of that, page 2, section 2 of that. Yeah, are you there?
Yes, I am, thank you.
Great. So it's just seeking some clarification around those figures. So you've got total windfall completions, an average over the last 5 years of 115 per annum. But then that breaks down between large sites, 10 or more dwellings at 65, and small sites at 51. So small sites being up to 10 dwellings. So I guess sort of listening to all of your evidence on the efforts that you've gone to identify as many sites as possible through the Sheila process. And you know, I have noticed going through the sites yesterday that there are a good number that are, you know, close to 10 or just above 10. And I wonder, therefore, whether, you are saying there's more flexibility in terms of windfall completions, but given that you have identified a good number of sites that are just above the 10 or between 10 and 30, let's say, so the largest windfall sites that might otherwise come forward, my question is, have you perhaps already identified those through the Sheila process? And is there realistically any more windfall capacity from that group? Appreciate there are smaller sites that could come forward that you possibly haven't identified. But yeah, just trying to get an understanding as to whether there's realistically any more capacity in that sort of above 10 and above section.
Okay, understood. Thanks, Inspector. I think our expectation here is that the changes to permitted development rights are likely to have an impact, and we did see some impact from the changes in 2015, 2016 around the conversion of office space. So the new changes introduced in September this year are likely, given the nature of the Ipswich urban area and the mix of uses we have, that there is potential we consider for some delivery through that process.
Okay.
And that would, clearly those would not be sites that have been identified through our SHELAR process.
So
Okay.
By their very nature. Yeah.
Sorry, so I just think the specific change, just for your note, is to allow for the demolition of offices and their conversion to resi rather than just conversion to resi.
Okay. Can I just ask Mr. Berent or Mr. Crossway, Mr. Edgley, Mr. Brown, do you have any comments on that particular point? Do you consider there to be additional potential in windfall terms?
Yeah, in terms of windfall and especially large scale windfall, the one thing I would say, just coming back to points I raised before in earlier hearing sessions, is around the brownfield land and the affordable housing delivery, and having a more nuanced approach to that in terms of what could be there. By reducing the if there is going to be a affordable housing contribution, then there may be negotiations, but that will take longer. It may discourage certain sites from coming forward in terms of that affordable housing contribution. By having a more flexible approach in terms of a differential approach within that policy, that may encourage more of those sites above 10 to come forward as part of that windfall. So I think it's looking at it in terms of the whole of the local plan, in terms of the policies and what might encourage more to come forward potentially within that 5-year supply, because there isn't the need for further negotiation and all sites just not coming forward on that, right? So in terms of the permitted development rights, clearly that has the potential to have an impact, but but I think it's looking at some of the policies in the round in terms of where those sites might come forward and how to encourage them to come forward. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Thanks.
Was there any other comments there? Mr. Edgley, yeah.
Thank you. I thought it was easier to put my hand up than find the raise hand button, so apologies for that. I think it's just sort of an observation. We hear what the council says around the windfall, and sort of acknowledge that, and obviously the changes from September in the permitted developments. It's just sort of an observation. I think continuing some of the themes from the earlier couple of days, just around the fragility of the supply, and I think it kind of again acknowledging the sort of high figures that we've been directed to in 15, 16, and 16, 17. If I've remembered my history correctly, that was just before the council adopted their last plan, or their most recent plan as well. So I think it's reasonable potentially to assume that some of them inflated figures were because that was development coming forward on sites which weren't identified in a local plan, but obviously were sort of suitable. I think we probably see quite a lot of plans where they have kind of that they haven't necessarily been reviewed as quickly as they should do. At the sort of later stages, their windfall numbers increase because the number of allocations has obviously been reduced over time. So potentially some of them higher numbers around windfall are just in terms of the monitoring that had gone on at that time. But again, certainly acknowledging that there could well have been an increase because of the office to residential conversion changes as well.
Thank you. And sorry, Ms. Baker, just to come back to the council on those couple of points. So
I'm still here, but I just have lost my video again. Apologies.
Okay. So just to come back to the council on the point made by the HBF about greater flexibility around policies, but also the comment made by Mr. Edgley about perhaps the reason for windfalls being higher in 15, 16, 16, 17 was just because it was just prior to the adoption of your plan, your current version of your plan. So could you just comment on those two points? Could your policies be more flexible to encourage more brownfield sites to come forward?
Sorry, might I come back on that, Inspector? I think the policies are very flexible with regards to the allocation of brownfield land and how they can come forward. We have a brownfield register which really does identify those sites. And in terms of promotion of additional conversions, for example, in the town centre, the policies support that as well. With regards to the contention that there may well have been an uptick in windfall delivery due to the fact that the plan hadn't been revised prior to 2017. That's not the case. This is the current one you're examining now is the third plan in a decade. So there was a plan in 2012 in place which reflected the then new MPPF position, and it was revised in 2017. And again, we're going for a review at the moment. And I do appreciate the comments about fragility, and I think we have discussed that throughout all of these hearings. Ipswich acknowledged that we are in a very difficult position. We have a historic amount of brownfield land within the town centre. It's a focus for regeneration. I'm going over points that I know that I've said before, but just for clarity, it's a post-industrial town. We have limited scope for greenfield sites, and we have allocated where we can. And we do feel we're in a position. We appreciate that the 5-year supply isn't as healthy as maybe some other rural communities might have, but we are constrained. But we do feel we have a 5-year supply, and we do feel we've got a plan that is absolutely worthy of adoption.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Baker, I'll hand back to you. Thank you for allowing.
Thank you, Mr. Hayden. That was very useful. Thank you for that. I have a...
oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, your audio is a bit interrupted, a bit disturbed.
For me.
I'm sorry, I must be having connection problems. I do apologise. Can you hear me any better now?
No, it's still the same. There's some interference in your connection.
Perhaps if I go out and rejoin, maybe that will help.
Shall we have a short adjournment to allow you to do that?
5 minutes?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We'll adjourn until 1:45. Thank you.
Karen, do you want to try your sound?
Yes, I tried to unmute myself, but it said you'd muted me.
Sorry.
That's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, brilliant. That's great. Thank you.
It's 11:44. We'll start back the meeting and we'll go live at 11:45. Thank you.
Well, welcome back. The hearing is resumed. Can I just check that you can all hear and see me clearly now? Lovely, thank you. Apologies for that. I had a few technical issues. I've managed to sort of rummage around and fiddle with some of the cables, and it seems to have worked. So apologies for that. I just wanted, we'd almost finished anyway in terms of question 48. I just wanted to ask if there were any further points that anyone wanted to make in respect of question 48 and the way forward. Is there anything that we'd missed, and would anybody like to say anything further on that? No, I see no hands, so that's lovely. We'll move on then, if I may, to propose changes to the plan. And Mrs. Barker, are there any changes that the council is proposing to the plan, to make to the plan in respect to the 5-year supply, that you want to draw to my attention for discussion this morning?
There were some, there are modifications proposed at the end of the Matter 3 statement, which includes things, for example, like revising the timing indications in Table 1 of Policy SP2, you know, short, medium, long term, etc.
Yeah.
There are, because the figures have been subject to minor amendments, there are figure changes within Policy CS7.
Yeah.
And we've updated the trajectory to an April 2020 base date, which, and again, some changes flow from that. For example, the Ipswich Garden suburb permissions granted in January change from one side of the equation to the other, if you like. So,
Yes.
so there are, you know, there are, because of the update to that April 2020 position, there are some follow-on changes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did anyone have any comments on any of those proposed changes that have been put forward by the council? I see I'm flickering again, apologies. Can you all hear me? Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. So I presume nobody has any further questions then in relation to the proposed changes. Just finally, before I close this session, I just wanted to say something about the way forward from here. Clearly, there's been a lot of evidence that we've heard over the course of the last few days in respect to the deliverability of the site allocations in the 5-year supply, as well as that expressed today. And there will be further evidence submitted by the council in respect to the table that we've asked you to complete. So myself and Mr. Hayden will need to go away and consider that evidence. But once we've done that, our aim is to write to the council, and it will probably be in the new year, certainly once the hearing sessions have been concluded. And that will set out our initial findings in respect of 5-year supply and possibly other matters as well, and set out the way forward as we see it. So I just wanted to make it clear that that was the way forward from our perspective, so that the council was clear as to what to expect from us. Did you have any questions of us in relation to that?
I don't think so. That's really helpful. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. We just thought it would help in terms of your planning your time as well, so that you knew what was likely to happen. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, then we're obviously going to close the hearing earlier than we anticipated. But thank you all very much for your participation and patience with my technology this morning. And we'll see those of you who are joining us for the Gypsies and Travellers session this afternoon at 2 o'clock. So thank you very much, and I'll close the hearing on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you.